Welcome back. Now, will they or won't they? That's a big decision which lies ahead for the South African government. Just last week, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant of arrest for Russian President Vladimir Putin over alleged war crimes in Ukraine. Now, Putin is expected to join his BRICS partners in South Africa for a summit in August, presenting government with the perfect opportunity to arrest the Russian president should they decide to do so. But will they actually arrest him? It doesn't seem likely. So let's unpack this further with political analyst Mpumelelo Mkhabela, who penned an article on News 24 on this matter, joins me live this evening. Thank you for your time. Mpumelelo, good evening to you. That's the big question. Do you think South Africa will or won't they arrest Vladimir Putin?
The short answer is no. South Africa won't arrest the Russian president.
Why so?
The stakes are just too high for South Africa, which has already tacitly shown support towards Russia, even though officially South Africa claims to be neutral in this ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And in addition to that, Russia is a key ally of South Africa in the BRICS formation, the Quad group, which also includes China and Brazil. And in any event, South Africa is at the moment chair of that group and is supposed to host this summit where people are speculating whether or not Putin could be arrested. So South Africa would be embarrassed to actually arrest a head of state when the stakes are so high globally.
Yeah, that's just on South Africa's part. But when it comes to Vladimir Putin, do you think he would actually make his way to the country? Don't you think he'd perhaps vouch for, I don't know, a Zoom option or sending through a representative as opposed to putting South Africa in a tight spot to, I suppose, also test waters? I don't know if you might want to take it that far. See, actually, they would stretch it that far.
Look, my view is that if Putin really cared about South Africa's reputation, he would not come to South Africa. He would perhaps send a representative or attend the meeting virtually. Because in that way, he would save South Africa from the dilemma of having to execute its obligations in terms of a Rome Statute, which means arresting him. And we already know that in terms of our own jurisprudence, that has already been decided in court in the case of the former leader of Sudan, al-Bashir, who the court decided, even on appeal, the courts were very insistent that actually South Africa is obliged to arrest somebody against whom a warrant has been issued by the ICC. So Putin would better save South Africa from that dilemma by staying away, by attending virtually, or sending a representative. If he forces to come here, if he comes here, South Africa will now have to choose between executing the law impartially, without fear or favor, or violating the law in favor of political expediency, which is basically in favor of continuing cordial diplomatic relations with Russia.
Right. Do you think South Africa is caught between a rock and a hard place here? On one hand, they almost place themselves, or rather itself, in a position where it has strong campaigns against, any violations of human rights. We've seen this with Israel, Palestine, and the stance with which they take. When it comes to the U.S., with their incidents where, of course, we've seen the U.S. invading in Iraq and looking for, weapons of mass destruction. We've seen South Africa's stance. But do you see consistency or non-consistency in other forms of violations of human rights?
No, South Africa is not consistent at all. If you remember on the US's invasion of Iraq, South Africa condemned it. It was very unequivocal. South Africa was very clear that the US should not invade Iraq. And even when it came to the issue of Western Sahara, for example, South Africa is very clear that Morocco should not continue to occupy that part of the territory. And on Palestine, South Africa is very clear also that Israel must pull out of West Bank and other areas, other portions of Palestine and allow a two-state solution where Palestine can enjoy its own independence. South Africa is very clear on that. But surprisingly, when Russia invades Ukraine, all of that position of non-invasion policy, if you call it that way, suddenly falls away. This is notwithstanding the fact that in all of these cases, there's a human rights question, as you correctly point out. There's a human rights question in Western Sahara. There's a human rights question in Palestine. obviously there were massive human rights violations with the US invading Iraq. So even now in Ukraine, the reason why we're talking about this issue now is precisely because the ICC has issued a warrant based on the fact that Russia is alleged to have violated human rights, particularly Putin and one of his assistants. So South Africa is not consistent. And I think the reason why South Africa is not consistent is because, one, first of all, South Africa has got ties with the former Soviet Union, of which Russia was a dominant part of that empire, of the sprawling empire of the Soviet Union, which included Ukraine. And there are still strong loyalties about that, because the ANC particularly had received a lot of support from the USSR. The second component, which follows from that, is that if you look at the ANC's resolutions from the 55th conference that had just concluded, they have taken an analysis that says that the war in Ukraine is a consequence of the US provoking Russia. And that provocation is part of the US's hegemony in the world, which the US would not want to end. They call it the Wolfowitz doctrine, which says that after the Cold War, the US does not want any other country in the world to dominate. So the ANC's analysis is firmly on the basis that the US is actually provoking other nations into a war. So once the ANC has taken that position, it's clear where it would stand on Putin. Yeah. Because Putin would, in terms of the ANC's analysis, be a victim of the US foreign policy in Europe. Because together with NATO, the US are expansionist militarily. They don't want another counterforce to emerge in the world. So, I mean, so from that perspective, I don't think there are doubts about whether the Putin could be arrested in South Africa. It won't happen.
What do you think then it would mean for South Africa's relations with the likes of the United States? Because since the war erupted, out in Ukraine, it almost seems as if the US was waiting for South Africa to take a stance, and not this very neutral, safe stance to say, let's encourage dialogue. Let's use that as a conflict resolution, as opposed to condemning one or the other. I mean, the US, and as far as the Republicans are concerned, are condemning even the military exercises that are taking place out in KwaZulu-Natal. So where do you think they are in terms of looking to what South Africa will do and what that subsequently would do or mean for their relations with South Africa? Actually,
I understand why the US, Western allies, Europe, and all of them would have expected South Africa to react differently. And the reason comes from South Africa's constitution, which is primarily a human rights-based constitution. And secondly, it comes from the fact that South Africa is, if you look at all of the elements of our constitutional democracy, we are in all aspects a liberal democracy. And with the human rights, with the constitution, which is supreme, and all of those elements. We have elections every 5 years. And these kinds of democratic prescripts are not applicable in Russia, in China, and in other countries. So the US sees South Africa from a values point of view as a country that is more aligned or closer to it. So it didn't think that South Africa would, abandon that and basically rather throw its loyalties around history, around the whole history of Western domination, the history of Western empire, of which the ANC has always been against. So the US was thinking that, look, as things stand now, South Africa's democracy is such that we are closer together than South Africa is closer to Russia or China or the other countries. But South Africa is different. South Africa is now thinking that we need to have a balance in the world. Right. We need to have a balance where the US can have a countervailing force. It can't be the preeminent hegemony throughout, unchallenged, because there's a risk that it can wholeheartedly dominate the whole world. So I'm thinking that the US perhaps was misguided in thinking like that. You can see there's a lot of diplomatic shuttling coming to South Africa. I mean, we've just recently hosted the Belgian
King and Queen. Yeah, they're still here.
Yes. And not long ago, Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of the Treasury Secretary, was here. Before that, Antony Blinken was here. We even had one of the relatively junior secretaries in the US attending the mining indaba in Cape Town. All of these efforts are part of lobbying South Africa to throw its weight behind the West when it comes to this Russian conflict with Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the conflict has taken a totally different dimension now. It's now clear that if you look at what China is doing, what Russia is doing, there's a clear realignment of forces around the world. China is now coming closer with Russia, and they're recruiting more other countries to come into their sphere of influence. And the US and other European countries are now realigning themselves. Not long ago, the German Chancellor was in the US. Today, Joe Biden is in Canada. And not long ago, the Japan Prime Minister was in Ukraine. You can see what is happening. There's a clear realignment of forces where almost as if the old Cold War split is being reformed again.
Now, I want to ask you where that places South Africa before I let you go, because I want to first quote in your article here on News 24, the last part where you ended off says, what all this means is that South Africa's jellyfishy approach to human rights poses no threat to anyone. It might be a consequence of diplomatic timidity or declining international clout. Now, in my last question to you, Mpumelelo, where does then that place South Africa's public reputation internationally?
South Africa's public reputation is obviously at risk. And part of the issue is that, look, even with this diplomatic neutrality that South Africa claims to have taken, at least rhetorical, even though in action we know they are on the side of Russia, you don't get a sense that South Africa is using that so-called neutrality or closeness to Russia to at least pave a way for peace. So as a result of which, Russia is basically using South Africa's proximity to it as a way to show the West, to say, listen, you might think that you have got influences among democracies like South Africa, the advanced democracy in Africa, but actually, hang on a bit, they are with us. So that's kind of a boasting that is happening internationally. So South Africa ends up being used instead of taking an independent stance that it can actually pursue aggressively. So if you are saying we are non-aligned, we want peace, give us a plan and show that you are aggressively pushing that peace. Don't be falling under the ambit or orbit of another influential power. Otherwise, it negates the whole idea of being neutral or being non-aligned.
Tumelo Mkhabela, we leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us right here on South Africa Tonight. Political analyst Tumelo Mkhabela weighing in on, of course, whether or not Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, will be arrested when he or if he does land in South Africa. That places, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa under the spotlights. All my appreciation to Mpumelelo Mkhabela.